All right, so today we're diving into something pretty interesting,
Yeah.
looking at autism and ADHD through a bit of a different lens.
hmm
We've got a whole stack of research here, actually, 78 studies to be exact,
Wow.
all looking at this thing called the International Classification of Functioning Disability and Health,
Yeah, the ICF.
ICF, right? Yeah, and trying to figure out how it can move us beyond just, the medical diagnosis piece.
Right. Because the ICF, it's really like a common language. It
Okay.
helps everybody, doctors, teachers, policymakers talk about how someone's actually functioning in their life,
Right.
not just slapping a label on them.
And it comes from the World Health Organization, right?
Yeah, the
So
WHO.
it's got some weight behind it. So instead of getting stuck on just symptoms,
hmm
it looks at, how your body's working, what you can actually do, how you're participating in life, and what your environment's like.
Exactly, the whole picture.
And they even have these like condensed versions called ICF course sets
Mm.
for specific conditions
Yeah.
like autism and ADHD.
Makes it a little easier to use.
Yeah. So what's really interesting to me is this idea that the ICF could actually shift how we think about these conditions.
I think so, too.
I've always focused on, what's different.
Yeah,
But the ICF makes us think about strengths, too,
absolutely.
and how the environment plays a huge role.
Can't ignore that.
So let's dig into these studies.
Okay.
What did they actually find out about how the ICF is being used?
Well, it's being used in all sorts of ways.
Mhm.
But one thing that really stood out was that most of the research so far has been focused on autism,
Interesting.
especially in kids.
Okay.
Most studies use the general ICF or the ITFCY,
Mm-hmm.
the child and youth version,
Mm-hmm.
but we are seeing the autism core set being used more and more,
Oh, that's good.
which suggests, people are starting to see how practical it can be.
So it's not just a theory.
Oh, definitely not.
Yeah.
Researchers are really putting it to work.
How so?
Well, for one thing, they're using it to guide their research, like what information they gather and how they analyze it makes everything more consistent.
Right.
And then there's this thing called ICF linking.
I haven't heard of that.
It's kind of like translating research findings.
Oh, interesting.
So researchers can map their data onto these standard ICF codes.
And that lets them.
Well, it means we can finally compare results from different studies in a meaningful way
Oh, that makes sense.
because they're all speaking the same language now.
Yeah, that's huge.
It is.
And what about those, measurements and assessments? Are they changing?
Yeah, the ICF is being used to check if those tools are actually capturing what matters about someone's functioning.
And is it holding up?
Well, some studies found that our current tools don't always cover everything the ICF says is important.
What do you mean?
Like, they might focus too much on physical or cognitive abilities and not enough on other areas.
Okay, so where are we seeing this ICF actually being applied, in the real world?
In lots of places, actually.
Yeah.
So in education,
Mhm.
it's helping us understand how the learning environment affects students with autism and ADHD
Right. So like,
and how we can support them better. For example, some research has shown that we often don't pay enough attention to how the environment itself can impact an autistic student's success in school.
right, like a classroom that's really overwhelming sensory-wise.
Exactly.
That can make a huge difference.
It could. And in employment,
Mm.
the focus is on what helps or hinders autistic individuals in the workplace.
And is the environment a big factor there too?
It is a major one, actually.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is that reviews found a lot of interventions still focus on changing the individual,
Oh, so that's
on adapting the workplace, which
Huh.
the ICF would suggest is important.
so sort of backwards.
Kind of, yeah. And then you've got interventions and therapies.
Mm-hmm.
The
Yeah.
ICF is helping shape and evaluate those two things, like equine therapy.
Okay.
One review pointed out that a lot of the evidence for horse therapy focused on physical outcomes rather than improvements in daily living skills,
Mm-hmm.
which is, what most people are looking for.
So the ICF is pushing us to think about what we're actually trying to achieve with these supports.
Exactly. We need to be more targeted.
It makes sense.
And when it comes to developing new measures of functioning,
Mm-hmm.
the ICF is really important there too, because it's so comprehensive. It can help us make sure we're covering all the bases.
But with so many new measures popping up,
Yeah.
is there a risk of kind of diluting the whole point of the ICF?
There is a risk of that.
How so?
If they're not all really aligned with the ICF's principles,
Okay.
we could end up with a bunch of measures that don't actually speak to each other.
Right.
Plus, we don't always know how good these new measures are. There's
Yeah.
psychometric properties.
Mm-hmm.
So the core sets are really valuable there because they offer a more standardized starting point.
So it sounds like we're moving in the right direction,
I think so.
but there's still work to do.
Oh, for sure. We're not quite there yet.
In the review mentioned one other thing, that most of this research is focused on kids.
That's right.
So what about adults?
Well, that's a gap we need to fill. We
Yeah.
need more research that looks at the entire lifespan.
Right, because autism and ADHD don't just disappear when you turn 18.
Exactly.
And they also found that very few studies looked at personal factors.
Right. Things like motivation, coping strategies.
And why is that?
Well, it could be because the WHO hasn't officially classified those within the ICF yet.
Ah, so we're missing a piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, kind of.
So to sum it all up, the ICF seems to be a really powerful tool
I think so too.
for understanding autism and ADHD,
Yeah.
not just as medical conditions, but by looking at how the person interacts with their environment.
Whole context.
Exactly. It's about seeing the bigger picture of how they're functioning in their life.
Absolutely.
But it makes you wonder, the ICF is catching on in research,
Yeah.
but how do we make sure these core ideas about focusing on strengths and the environment,
Right.
how do we make sure those actually translate into how we support neurodiversity
Yeah.
in our everyday lives and in our policies?
Yeah.
How do we move beyond just studying it to really living by those principles?
That's the big question.
Yeah, that's something to think about for sure.
It is.
Well, that's our deep dive for today. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for having me.
It was great talking to you. It was fun.
Yeah, it was.
See you next time.
Bye.